Hello and welcome to today's workshop, Fundamentals of Finance, Best Practices for Grassroots Groups. My name is Lynn Gidluck and I have the privilege of leading the Community Engagement and Research Center at the University of Regina. If I haven't had the privilege of meeting you yet, please introduce yourself to me if you happen to run into me out and about in the community. I love random encounters in grocery stores by people who attend these sessions, especially by people I have only met on Zoom. I'm so glad you could join us today for the second session in our Spring 2022 Nonprofit Management Essentials series. The Community Engagement and Research Center is pleased to offer these workshops in partnerships with the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. Last week, we did an experiment with offering our workshops in a hybrid format. Since the vast majority of people who attended preferred to join by Zoom, we decided to not mess with a good thing. If you attended last week, we apologize for the logistical challenges that were experienced, and thank you for your patience as we try to figure out this new world that we're living in, which we hope is kind of a post-COVID world, but I don't know, like it's still a really strange world we're living in. Anyways, it's such a beautiful day in Treaty 4 territory, where the offices of the Community Engagement and Research Center and the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation are located. We are so grateful to be able to live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Naheawak, Anasinapek, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota First Nations and the homeland of the Métis. This, as I said, this is the second of 3 sessions that Sherry Hildred will be delivering for us. If you registered for the workshop, you should have received an email from me a few minutes ago with the slide deck that Sherry is going to use today. If you joined at the last minute after seeing the email I sent out this morning, please leave your email address in the chat box so that I can add you to the list of people to send the toolkit handouts that Sherry's going to share with us later today. We hope you will join us next week on Wednesday. So let's not be confused, not Tuesday next week. It's Wednesday next week, from June 1st, for her final session in this series, Effective Recruitment and Retention. I can't wait to hear Sherry's ideas on how to attract and keep staff and volunteers. I think that's a topic that so many of us have issues with. So without further ado, I am now pleased to turn the floor over to the amazing Sherry Hildred with Valmore Consulting. I'm going to pop her biography in the chat box for those of you who did not see the marketing materials that we put together. I'm sure that you'll be quite amazed at the just breadth of experience and expertise that she brings to this topic. And thank you again, Sherry, for being so generous with your time and joining us in offering these workshops for us.
Great. Thanks so much, Lynn, for that lovely introduction. So appreciate it. And thank you also, Lynn, for the opportunity to engage with so many organizations. Again, my name is Sherry Hildred. I'm a project management professional by virtue of designation and the work that I do with the University of Regina in teaching project management alongside professional and leadership management classes, and of course delivering workshops of this nature. I do also want to thank South Sask Community Foundation. Without their support, these workshops wouldn't be possible. And as I was saying to Lynn and Victor from South Sask Community Foundation this morning offline before we got started, these are the types of tools and short webinars and informational sessions that I so wished I had, 15 years ago when I started focusing almost exclusively working in the nonprofit sector. So in addition to not just sharing the information, I really commiserate with folks. Right up to this day, I have my own nonprofits that I provide management and consultant services to. And every day I am working wearing a different hat in the nonprofit sector. So again, I so appreciate the opportunity to give back to community and just share some of this basic information and knowledge that can make a huge difference, particularly in smaller organizations that don't have extensive staff. So again, really pleased to be here today. As Lynn said, this is the second in the series that we're doing. I see many familiar names in the Zoom room here today. Good to see folks, and some new names too, so that's always nice. What I'm going to do, folks, is just move over into our shared slide deck. So that's the slide deck that Lynn sent out this morning. And we're going to start navigating through the fundamentals of finance. So really looking at some of those best practices in grassroots organizations, community organizations, nonprofit entities. As I was saying, this is the second in the series. So we've got another session coming up next week focusing on effective recruitment and retention. And I'll remind folks about that again as well at the end of this session. For those of you that did attend last week, you will recall that I always say in my sessions, the information is great. It's really important to go through these different subject matters, really build literacy in a variety of areas when we're running nonprofits or sitting on nonprofit boards. One of the areas of literacy that we're going to cover today, of course, is finance. Now, the information is great. We're going to cover an awful lot in the next couple of hours, preserving time for question and answer, of course, and you are always welcome to put your questions in the chat as well. However, beyond just the information, I always find it important to have something for a takeaway for folks. So in this case, there are two documents that I've put together that will be the takeaways that Lynn's going to send out after the session today. One is a financial management checklist. So a very simplistic tool to use in really looking at the overall health and how well managed is the organization from or through a financial lens. It's a self-assessment tool. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we're going through the session today. And then as we're sort of building out the best practices around the fundamentals of finance, I also have included in the package that Lynn will send out a financial policy checklist. And again, this is really just to start, sort of documenting. It's very short, very simple, but to start documenting the areas that an organization is quite strong in from a policy standpoint and where the gaps may exist. And again, I'll talk about both of these handouts as we're going through the materials. And as I always say, folks, the information is great, but I always want you to have a takeaway tool, something that actually allows you to apply or look at your own organization after the session and just have a really good consideration. In this case, it's the financial component that we're looking at. So have a really good look. Where are we strong? Where do we maybe have gaps, things that we could tighten up in financial management? So with that, as I say, I'm going to move over to my shared screen. Just bear with me one moment here, folks. And you will have momentarily, you should have a single slide coming up. It'll just take a second here. And I'll pop it over to a full slide view for you. It lets me, it's kind of slow this morning. Just one moment. Okay, so this probably still has the thumb note. It's not letting me share for some reason. Hang on one moment here. Maybe try that again. Oh, sorry, folks, it's not cooperating. And the one morning, Lynn, that we didn't do an actual tech check because it's like, oh, it always works. We'll just give this another try here.
If it doesn't work, Sherry, I can always pull it up on mine and.
Yeah, I don't know why it's being finicky. Let me try one more time, Lynn. It's allowing me to bring it up, but it's not allowing me to, I guess it probably doesn't matter in all honesty if it's the thumbnail, but I like to bring up the full slide deck where possible. Try that again. Is it still, you're still seeing the thumbnail on the side?
I think you need to go to slideshow maybe. First.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not letting me toggle over to, yeah, it's not letting me toggle over to the here we go. There we go. That should work now. Yes?
Perfect.
Yay, finally got there. I guess Zoom and PowerPoint are still on their long weekend vacation here or something. So a little bit slow getting started. So again, good morning, folks, and welcome to the Fundamentals of Finance. Again, the main areas that I want to cover today, if we're just sort of looking at overarching learning objectives, the main pieces that I want to cover are really around understanding and building a little bit of capacity around what the board's financial responsibilities are. So the board of directors, what do they hold by way of responsibility? Both the fundamental sort of fiduciary responsibility or duties of a nonprofit board, as well as the financial components. And there is a link between risk management, between a board of directors properly carrying out their duties and what they are expected to do when it comes to financial planning and budgeting. I also want to look at the roles of a finance committee and the treasurer. And again, remember folks, always it's about what is scalable for an organization. So depending on the size and complexity of the organization, how much of a working board versus a policy governance board exists will really drive out the effort of work that board and or staff on a sort of sliding scale will engage in relative to the financial components of an organization. So again, want to start with that overarching piece because ultimately the board is financially responsible. So in turn, we want to look at, well, what are their duties? What are their responsibilities when it comes to financial planning, budgeting, having a finance committee or not, the role of a treasurer, for example. And again, understanding that there is a link between financial risk and the overall financial controls or policy of the organization. And again, this is what the board should be concerned with. They are ultimately financially responsible for the organization. So how do we offset or support that risk management through financial policy? The other piece that I want to cover is just some really basic understanding of the basic accounting principles, concepts, basic financial reports that nonprofits will often generate, often present to their boards of directors, and just a little bit of information on how to read and interpret and really understand the various financial reports that might be generated. And again, how those help the board support and meet their obligations and their legal requirements. So again, we're going to touch on a few various topics that collectively really serve as the fundamentals of finance for nonprofits. Before we get started, folks, as always, for those of you that have been in my sessions before, you know that I always like to focus on a couple of things. One, it's not just the work here today, the time that we're going to spend together. And yes, we'll certainly have time for question and answer before we wrap up the session this morning. But I have included for you, as always, my email address. And I do encourage you, should you have any questions, there's things that you're specifically maybe struggling with within your organization when it comes to financial policy, building policy, understanding policy, even financial reporting, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to have a conversation offline, send additional tools, understand what your maybe unique circumstances or issues are that you're dealing with. And I absolutely am happy to sort of help provide any additional support that might be required. Again, I always say, folks, there is existing capacity within your organization. So this isn't, reinventing the wheel. It's really just about looking at where your organization is today. What are some of those best practices when it comes to finance and financial management matters? And maybe we're just going to reorganize some of that thinking or expand on it with some additional tools or additional approaches. So again, we'll cover the material today, but please don't hesitate to reach out. I was saying to Lynn this morning, I still have folks that I owe some follow-up from last week's session where they reached out with some very unique circumstances in their organizations related to governance. And I'm more than happy to help out where I can. For our logistics today, folks, so again, I'll do a brief overview of our session outline. Our timeline is until noon today. We have Lynn, and we also have Victor from South Sask Community Foundation on the line, and I'll call them sort of my moderators, if you will. I am going to try to pay attention to the chat. You are welcome to put questions, comments into the chat. I will try to keep up with that during the session, but should I miss anything or any questions that may come up, maybe we'll answer them at the end if I have missed them. So thanks so much, Lynn and Victor, for kind of keeping a mindful eye on the chat there today. Again, the real opportunity here is for us to connect and engage. So again, please don't hesitate to ask any questions. I will say, honestly, folks, when it comes to the fundamentals of finance, I find that this is the area most often that individuals where they don't have the knowledge, they're often very reluctant to ask questions. Whether they, they feel silly that they don't know the basics, or board members who really don't understand. I've had board members say to me, well, I don't want to ask any questions because I don't know this information. I don't want to look like I don't know because I'm sitting on the board. No silly questions, no judgment whatsoever. The whole point of this session is to start to build a little bit more of that financial literacy. So whether you are representing an organization or as a staff member or as a board member, safe space here, folks, to ask any questions and really start building some of that financial literacy. And as I say, I always find the area of finance seems to be the most sensitive one, or the one that folks won't necessarily ask questions. And again, if you're not comfortable putting a question into the chat or turning on your audio and asking a question, you can always email me after the workshop as well. So again, really looking forward to getting into our materials today. Just a couple of pieces I want to share with you. There are always materials that I reference in the development of any workshop or seminar, this one included. So again, I've given credit where credit is due to a variety of resources that I've referenced. And in some instances, I'll actually put the credit right on the slide if I haven't already referenced these particular materials that I've looked at. Again, I wouldn't call this, required reading. It's simply reference reading should you be interested or you want to know more about any of these particular publications. Again, please don't hesitate to ask. They each bring a wealth of knowledge and information that really works well within nonprofit organizations when it comes to finance. The other piece I just always like to note, folks, as I say, in addition to my work at the university, teaching a variety of classes, working with the community engagement research unit on workshops such as this, there are many nonprofit organizations that I work with, have worked with in the past, and I've just included a few here on the screen for you. Some of them are very large, pan-Canadian organizations where I'm reporting through to a national board of directors. Other are smaller local organizations where I've maybe come in and helped them with their strategic planning, their governance framework, doing a financial review, looking at their policies, different aspects of operations. So again, it does not matter if you are a large organization or a smaller organization. Everything we're going to cover is absolutely scalable and applicable to organizations of all size. So don't think that you have to have, full policy governance model board for this financial overview to make sense or to be applicable to your organization. Large or small, these components all have a fit. So for this session itself, there are a number of different learning objectives I wanted to set out. We started, for those of you that attended last week, we talked a little bit about this idea of governance, or governance 101. What does it mean when we talk about stewarding an organization through sort of a board of directors lens versus managing an organization? So we're going to springboard a little bit from that governance component when we talk about board responsibilities, and then really hone in on the financial risk and risk management. So last week, for those of you that attended, we looked at the broader context, all the areas of governance that would be applicable to a nonprofit. Today, we're going to very quickly cover a broader overview, but start honing in on that financial piece. So again, financial risk and risk management. To better understand these concepts, we will of course look at basic accounting concepts. So again, looking at basic financial statements, how to read them, how to interpret them, what are they telling us, how to properly build a budget, for example. So again, many of you will already be doing this on an annual cycle within your organizations. Again, we just want to take that organizational information you already have and processes you have, maybe expand on them, maybe organize them a bit better. And as I say, takeaways for both large and small organizations. For this session, as I say, two primary takeaways, a bit of a financial management checklist, as well as financial policies for you to consider within your organization. So as we're looking at this idea, we'll start with governance and the role of boards and their responsibilities around financial management. It really does come down to a matter of accountability. So the idea that nonprofits, this is a pretty impressive area. If you look at, for example, even the Stats Canada reporting I recently looked at, they do a pretty deep dive about every 4 years or so. The latest report I was just reading the other day, the economic activity in Canada in the nonprofit sector alone is just about $170 billion in economic driver that supports Canada's economy. So when we look at our gross domestic product, that means charitable organizations and registered nonprofits make up a significant, it's about 7.4%, almost 7.5% of Canada's gross domestic product. So when we look at this idea of accountability, at the organizational level, we talk about being, transparent and accountable, and that we have proper mechanisms in place to manage finances and to manage risk related to money management. But at a really high level, nonprofits are making a serious contribution to the economy in Canada. And for that reason, it really, it stands to reason that boards of directors play a very serious role in accountability of financial resources. So when we talk about accountability, the law always supersedes. So when we look at, why do nonprofits exist? We looked at some of those governance pieces last week. We have nonprofit legislation that really establishes a nonprofit organization. And of course, there are financial reporting requirements in order to maintain that nonprofit status. So again, here in Saskatchewan, we have our Information Services Corporation. Many of you will be familiar with filing your annual return. And then of course, if an organization has registered charity status, other federal requirements, of course. And then we go all the way down to our bylaws of our organization, how we set out, how we're going to run and operate. So all of these aspects, whether it's law that supersedes or our own bylaws, constitution, and then all the way down to our policies and procedures, this creates that accountability framework. Within that accountability framework, we also look at governance versus management. And that's the piece we really dove into last week. Board's responsibility for governing, stewarding an organization, making sure that policies are approved. And then of course, the management, individual staff who are tasked with applying and adhering to those policies. So again, the board's role very often is approving policy. Staff will implement, use those policies and procedures, but the board's responsibility doesn't stop there. The board needs to make sure that those policies are being adhered to. So again, this is where we really get into those roles and responsibilities of directors relative to financial management. Now, one of the primary pieces, if you will, when we talk about boards needing to be informed as to how the organization is being managed to protect its legal responsibility, this really puts emphasis on the board from sort of two lenses. One of those is around their fiduciary responsibility. So we talk about fiduciary responsibility. We set this stage to ensure that we have adequate policy that speaks to boards of directors being able to adhere to their fiduciary responsibility and to ensure that they're not engaged in any kind of conflict of interest. So again, a board of director member is in a special relationship of trust, if you will, with that nonprofit organization. They are agreeing to operate and steward the organization in good faith. They need to do that on an informed basis. So it's not just enough to rubber stamp financial reports every month when they come out or every quarter. The board needs to be informed. So they really need to understand that those policies that have been approved are in play and that they're being adhered to. So this is one mechanism that boards use for risk management to really know that the best interest of the organization is being protected and that they're doing their very best job in carrying out their fiduciary responsibility. And of course, the other side of that is having an awareness of conflict of interest. So again, folks, I always say, with our fiduciary responsibility or that special relationship of trust that is based on a duty of care, it requires trust. It requires being informed as to what's going on within the organization and being assured that the organization is being run the way the board has agreed to, the way they've approved in their bylaws, and how they've approved the policies for the organizations. When we look at this idea of awareness of conflict of interest, and I just always like to include a little bit of information. Fiduciaries, so board of director members who have a fiduciary responsibility, are referred to as fiduciaries, and fiduciaries cannot in any way, shape, or form take advantage of opportunities that will benefit them in some way because of their role on the board of directors or because of their relationship with an organization. And this is why we talk about conflict of interest. So for example, when we're looking at conflict of interest, first of all, I want to flag that conflict of interest is not a bad thing. It just is. We can't avoid it entirely. It simply exists. So I don't want you to think of conflict of interest as bad. It's just simply something that has to be disclosed to make sure that we have that level of accountability. So again, for a board member, a conflict of interest would arise when a board member is in a situation where their decision may make a real, actual, or a perceived conflict of interest that they would personally, financially, or otherwise, from a business standpoint, could gain from their role or their position on the board of directors. And this happens, the situation of the conflict of interest can often happen. So I have organizations that I run where, for example, we'll have an individual come into the organization and they'll be a client or a consumer. They'll actually use the services of the nonprofit, but yet, as time goes on, they may come back and serve on the board of directors, and then they might ultimately be making decisions and relative to their own personal or business interest, they may have to just self-declare a conflict. So for example, I'm declaring a conflict of interest. I can't make a vote on this particular motion because I happen to know the individual that owns the company or owns the leasing company, for example, or portions of the budget when they're being approved. You may have boards of directors that step away. Again, actual or real, or even perceived conflict of interest, it's just simply declaring it. And very often, folks, when we're seeing a conflict of interest, it will be relative to a monetary situation. So voting on something, for example, I work with nonprofits that hold money that will receive grant applications and adjudicate that money. So again, if I have a board member that is from, Momart, Saskatchewan, they're sitting on the board and Momart, Saskatchewan has applied for a grant, that board member is going to step away because again, it may not even be a real conflict of interest, but just the idea that it's perceived because that board member lives in that community. That community has applied for a grant. It wouldn't be viewed as fair or equitable for that board member to adjudicate that grant application from their own community. So again, very often when we're talking about conflict of interest, it is relative to overall financial matters within an organization and really maintaining that transparency and that accountability. So again, just a quick word on conflict of interest. The other piece I always like to cover, folks, is just a brief overview when we talk about the board's responsibility relative to governance of an organization. So it will start with the board owning the responsibility of setting the vision, the mission, the values of the organization, as well as its strategic goals. Once we start moving from our strategic direction into how are we going to do this work, this is really where this session today comes into play. The idea that we need to develop appropriate budgets. So it's not enough to have a strategy for the organization or have goals and priorities and initiatives and programs and deliverables. We have to balance that strategic approach and the work, the annual work, with resources, human resources and financial resources. So the board owns a role around approving an annual budget, and they also manage their risk management responsibility by approving policies that will ensure not just process for budget approval, but actual expenditures of those resources or those finances. And again, that governance piece goes full continuum over to the oversight piece. So monitoring those policies, reviewing progress reports, reviewing financial reports, which we're going to look at today, to ensure that the organization is adhering to the budget that was approved, utilizing the financial policies that were approved, and really keeping the organization transparent and accountable. So again, just to reinforce, it does not matter what size of organization. It does not matter if it is a board of directors that is more of a working board, if you will. They're actually carrying out some of the delivery of programs and services, or if it's the complete opposite end of the pendulum, where the board of directors is entirely governance-based. They're simply only stewarding the organization, approving policies, setting strategic vision, and then of course engaging in that monitoring and oversight, and the staff are doing the work. So regardless, the board of directors is ultimately bearing the burden of the financial responsibility of the organization. In a working board, they just happen to wear more than one hat. They happen to also be doing operational activities. In the full governance model, it will be staff and only staff that are carrying out the work, and of course reporting through to the board of directors. So again, there's no single right way or approach. The tools that we'll look at, the generation of financial reports, reading and understanding them, the processes for building and approving an annual budget can be applied to any organization. Now, in most organizations, even in a working model and a non-governance model board, we will have key positions on the board of director, typically a chair, a vice chair. Sometimes you'll have a first vice, a second vice, very typically a treasurer, and very typically a secretary. And again, that's just typical. Organizations use lots of really interesting and interchangeable language to name their officers. But very often it will be the treasurer, when we're looking through the financial lens, that is appointed by or set out in the bylaws as an officer of the corporation. So I want to look at the roles and responsibilities of a treasurer. Again, these will vary somewhat depending on how robust the organization is from a staffing standpoint. So for example, I have nonprofits I work with where it's a full working board. The treasurer is actually involved in building, not just approving, building the annual budget, building grant applications. Then I have other nonprofits I work with where the treasurer role on the board simply serves as the chair of the finance committee, will work with executive staff who are developing the budget, will be a bit of a conduit. So the treasurer will be a bit of a conduit between executive management in the organization and the board of directors. And typically we'll do that as not just as the treasurer, but as the chair of a finance or a finance and audit committee. So again, the role of the treasurer can again vary depending on the governance structure of the organization. So for the treasurer job description that I've outlined here, and as we talked about last week, every board member under proper governance should have a job description that articulates some of those expectations. So what you see here, folks, is not carved in stone. This is just a really good sample of what you would generally see or very typically see in a treasurer's job description. So absolutely requirement to attend all board meetings, having knowledge of the organization and a commitment to its goals and objectives to steward the organization. Typically with a treasurer, we want that individual to have understanding of financial accounting, specifically for nonprofits. So not just general understanding, but to really understand nonprofits, because we are different. How we build our budgets, the best approaches, having to work with very limited resources, both human and financial. There's, an art to it. It is different than for-profit business. We still need accountability, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, but the approach in understanding financial accounting for nonprofit is unique. Very often, the treasurer will serve, as I say, as the chair of the finance committee or the finance and audits committee. I've also heard the board committees referred to as audit and risk committee. So again, serve as a chair to that committee. And as the treasurer, as I say, is a bit of a conduit, if you will, or a convener between executive staff in an organization, management staff, and the board of directors themselves. Again, the role will vary depending on the size of the organization. Very typically, the treasurer is going to manage, along with the finance committee, the board's review of and any action related to the board's financial responsibilities. So that's approving a budget, that's looking at monthly or quarterly financial statements, looking at draft audited financial statements once prepared by the auditor, working with senior executive or management within a nonprofit, relative to even reporting on adherence to policies. So again, the role of the treasurer can be quite varied depending on the size of the nonprofit. Most often that treasurer is going to work with the CEO, the chief executive officer, the executive director of the organization, and the chief financial officer, CFO. Sometimes it'll be a chief operations officer, a COO, finance control manager. Again, the staff positions can have a variety of names as well. And typically that treasurer is going to work with one or two of those more senior staff to really make sure that the financial reports are generated, that they're accurate, that they're included in the board package if the board is meeting once a month or once a quarter. They're also going to ask questions that potentially the board may ask. So the treasurer often will ask questions sort of just as a heads up to say, I think the board might ask about why do we have such a variance in one of our line items, perhaps related to fund development or current expenditure within a fiscal year. So again, it's sort of that really critical set of eyes that the treasurer brings. The treasurer will, once an organization has built its annual budget, which is typically staff work to build the budget, the treasurer will bring that annual budget forward and will be able to speak to it, defend it to the board of directors, and look for approval. And again, many organizations will have policies that talk about how budgets are brought forward, the policy around how an annual budget is approved, and then of course policy on how we're going to show and demonstrate adherence to that policy while remaining transparent and accountable. And as I say, the treasurer is also typically involved in annual audit, answering board member questions about the audit or about the draft financial statements themselves. Again, a treasurer does not have to be, a CA or a CPA. They just have to have really good, solid financial literacy, and with a particular focus on understanding the workings of a nonprofit organization. So when we look then at beyond, sort of beyond this role of the treasurer, which I know it can look or appear to be a very onerous position if an individual is agreeing to be a treasurer on a board of directors. However, between some of the basic understanding, some of the core activities, and of course, in larger organizations, the support of management staff who really are doing the bulk of the heavy lifting or the bulk of the work around budget development and budget management, there are a few primary core or key activities. So the first, folks, is around building the actual annual budget. So the idea here is that the proper approach to budget development, and I'm going to talk about this later again, very often as nonprofits, we tend to look at, well, here's our pool of money. So here's what we know we have in core funding, if you're fortunate enough to have core funding. Here's grants that we've applied for that we know we have received, or we're fairly certain we're going to receive for the fiscal year. So we often sort of look at that pool of money and then try to make it work. How are we going to do everything we want to do with those limited resources? And in proper or best practice budget development, what we should be doing in nonprofits is really looking at, continually looking at our strategic plan. So, here is our vision. Here's where we're headed. This is the mission of our organization, the mandate of our organization. And here are the primary goals that the board has set out. And out of those goals, we have objectives, initiatives, programs, different strategies, projects that we want to engage in. So in building an annual budget, it's really about talking about who we are, what are all of the different things that we want to do, or ideally we'd like to do, planning for those resources to execute. So what are the human and financial resources? And then we consider our budget. So instead of taking a pot of money and trying to do, I always say it's sort of like trying to do a little bit of everything. So an inch deep and a mile wide, or do we pick one or two things, 3 or 4 programs, strategies, and we're going to do them really well instead of spreading our resources, our people, our dollars so thin that we can't really do any one thing in an exceptional way. So again, in budget development, and I'll talk more about this later, it's really about thinking about what is key to the organization. How are we best going to serve our vision and our mission and our mandate? Which are those activities, programs, projects that are going to deliver the most value, the most outcome to community, not just output, not just the number of programs we're running, but the actual outcomes, so the impact to community. More on that to come when we talk about budget development. Other core activities for both staff and boards to be mindful of: accounting systems. So what is the system that is being used, and how financial statements are then generated. So again, in smaller organizations, it wouldn't be uncommon to even use a basic Excel spreadsheet to manage the development of budgets and even to track expenditures through the year. So smaller organizations can even get away with something very simplistic. Most nonprofits are using some form of accounting software. Probably one of the most popular is QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online, QBO. Tends to be one of the most favored accounting systems. Regardless of the system, it's all about just because you have an accounting system doesn't mean that you have good, clean financial statements. It's all about what we input into any system. So the accuracy of the information going into QBO or the accuracy of the information going into an Excel spreadsheet. So again, it's determining that mechanism. From there, we have the ability to generate various types of reporting, which will then be analyzed. And we're going to look at some of the very typical, most common types of financial reports that boards will look at, that they can and should be looking at on a regular cycle. So again, for a smaller organization, maybe they're looking at those reports once a month, maybe once a quarter in a larger organization. And then of course, end of year financial reporting, which again, very often will be developed by an auditor. Smaller organizations that have an operating budget under $250,000 can simply have a review of the financial statements. They're not required to have audited financial statements. So again, depending on the size of the organization, there'll be different reporting that happens in year, different reporting that's favored by the board of directors as well. So there may be requests by the board that we want to see financial statements presented in a certain manner to help their financial literacy and their understanding of what's actually happening in the organization throughout the year. Equally so, the development and monitoring of financial policies is a critical component of the board's responsibility relative to risk management. Policies are also a critical component of running a nonprofit organization. So I always say, in a very traditional or typical nonprofit that's headed up by an executive director, for example, that executive director really needs two things to do their job well. They need a board-approved strategic plan. So think about painting lines on a road, if you will. They need a board-approved strategic plan. So here's the direction I'm going. That's one lane painted on the highway. The other thing that an executive director needs are board-approved policies, because that provides the other lane, so you don't run the other line rather on the road, so you don't run off into the ditch. So again, a strategic plan and then policies, as long as I'm following that strategic direction, those goals, and I'm doing so within the policies, which will include how an annual budget is approved. As long as I'm staying between those two lines in the road, that is critical for an executive director to really move the organization forward. So again, for organizations that I work with, if there is an absence of a strategic plan or policies, that's an absolute flag to me. We need to get those things in place. There's no way to run the organization and be accountable without some scalable version of both of those. Another big responsibility for both the organization and the board in their oversight role is to ensure the management of cash flow. So cash flow is how much money is coming into the organization. What have we approved in our budget for money going out of the organization, but also the timing. So it's not just money coming in and money going out. When we talk about managing cash flow, it's making sure that the organization at any given point in time has the resources it needs. So again, you could have, for example, in nonprofit, very common, will be approved for a grant that we've applied for. We only received 75% upfront, for example, and we're not going to receive that other 25% until that project is done or that program is built, or that service is delivered. So we have to find a way to manage that gap in funding. So between the 75 that's received and the 25 we won't get until the project's complete, how are we going to manage that expenditure that's required? How are we going to ensure that we have enough money coming into the organization, or managing the cash flow to balance when employees have to be paid, when insurance premiums are due, when other expenditures are required? So again, managing cash flow and looking at very simplistic reporting around cash flow goes an awful long way in giving boards of directors assurance that the organization is healthy and being well managed. There are other risk management pieces that come in the form of policy around transactions, whether an organization is allowed to do electronic transfers or other e-vendor payments, internal controls. If you have cash management, you're managing a petty cash, for example, other controls relative to managing grants and contracts. So boards of directors, again, are getting appropriate reporting so they know that funders are receiving quarterly or annual reports as required. So again, a policy can really support a number of aspects of risk management. The other risk management activity is this idea of in-year statutory remittances. So an organization proving that it has, in fact, filed GST returns, or employee deductions, for example, have been, payroll deductions have been submitted to CRA that appropriate annual filings have been complete, whether it's with Information Services Corporation or Services Canada. So again, these are all of the major activities that you would see. But again, it might feel kind of odorous at first when we look at it, but really it's about what is the money coming in, what income is generated, what is being spent, and that those assets are being protected properly through policy and other mechanisms, that all finances are present and accounted for at all times. So again, this is really the bulk of what we see within the fundamentals of financial management within a nonprofit. Now, some of the best practices, folks, and I've sort of divided this out into the work that is required by staff in a nonprofit, finance committee. So I'm looking at a very traditional nonprofit that would have staff doing the work around preparing financial reports, a finance and audit committee that is going to review those financial reports before they go to the board, and then the board's job in actually approving both the budget and then the financial statements, reviewing and approving financial statements throughout the year, as well as approving financial policy. So I've really tried to chunk this out in sort of a Coles Notes version. What is staff responsible for? And again, remember, this is going to flux and change depending on the governance model of the organization. But generally, staff are going to prepare the annual budget, prepare the financial statements. The finance committee is going to vet those before they go to the board of directors. And then the board is going to approve those various policies, financial reports, annual budgets. The same is true of audited statements. Your auditor is going to prepare those financial statements in conjunction with staff. And so auditor comes in, does testing, staff supports the auditor. The draft audited statements are generated. They're reviewed by staff in the organization. They go to the finance committee for review, and then ultimately they go to the board for approval, and then off to the AGM, of course, for member approval. Again, with financial statements, I've done the same thing, broken it down where staff are going to monitor on a regular daily basis our incomes, our expenses. We're building financial reports. We're building annual budgets for approval. The finance committee is having a look at those financial reports, asking any questions, working with staff in the organization. And then, of course, the financial reports are going to go to the board of directors, who in turn may ask the treasurer questions about the financial reports. They may also ask staff questions about those financial reports. And then finally, the control section. So this is where the board has that responsibility to ensure that policies are in place that allow the board to be confident that the monetary assets of the organization can be properly utilized and accounted for. So again, although it is the board responsibility to make sure adequate controls and policies are there, that they're approved, very often staff will actually flag and say, we have a gap in policy. So, we've gone through, or as we're doing our day-to-day work, here's what's getting in the way. Here's something that would make it easier, more effective or efficient to do our work. And that could be raised and ultimately become a net new policy of the organization. Again, if there's issues that are being raised by staff, they would typically go to the treasurer, and I mean financial gaps in financial policy. Those conversations would happen with the treasurer and or the finance committee to support the development of new policy. And again, ultimately, the board would be approving that policy. So again, as long as the staff are adhering to those board approved policies and can demonstrate that those financial controls aren't just in place, but we're actually following them, then we have that level of transparency and accountability that board members require, that they need to assure is in place, but that they also have to be confident are being followed to really carry out both their fiduciary responsibility and their financial responsibility for the organization. So a very significant area of board work, a very significant area of staff work. And for any of you that have done the work of applying for grants, reporting on grants, the magnitude of work that's required in generating financial statements, identifying variances, reporting to boards of directors. This is a very significant area, and it is one that really does need to be done and done well. So before we move into some of the more typical approaches to looking at overall financial management, there's a couple of myths, if you will, that I wanted to sort of dispel. I find over the course of time in doing these financial fundamentals workshops, there are a number of questions that will be raised very often. And I wanted to share those sort of myths or mythbusters with you today. One that comes up very often is that a nonprofit must operate non-commercial activities only. And that is not true. Many nonprofits have commercial activities, very often referred to as self-generated revenue or commercial enterprise or unique enterprise within a nonprofit. So they could be running, for example, there's nonprofits that own apartment buildings. There's nonprofits that have stores that they own. Absolutely, a nonprofit can engage in commercial activity. You are not excluded from engaging in commercial activity. So again, very often folks will ask, well, can a charity actually undertake commercial activity? Yes, you can. A charity can perform commercial activity, but remember, we must do so with the purpose of advancing its charitable purpose. So it's not for any other reason than those revenues would go back in to advance the purpose of that organization. Another myth that I often come across, a nonprofit cannot invest its funds or donations. That is not true. You can certainly have both a surplus, which identifies or also speaks to item number 3 on the screen. You can, and quite frankly, a nonprofit should have a surplus if it's being run responsibly. We'll talk about that briefly on the next slide. And absolutely, you can invest. So again, it is common for charities and nonprofits to make investments. We want to do so responsibly. And to do that, you should have an investment policy. Very often for organizations I work with, I'll suggest a sustaining reserve and investment policy. So it sets out upper and lower thresholds of what we would hold in surplus, as well as how risky of an investment we are willing to put our monies in. So again, typically low risk, looking at a very responsible way to invest wisely. So it might be as simple as, a Manulife savings account that pays a couple percent interest, for example, very low risk. But certainly it is a myth that you cannot not invest. You absolutely can invest money, and you certainly can, and in fact should carry a surplus. This idea that a nonprofit has to spend all of its money and do so as soon as possible is absolutely a myth. A charity can decide, a nonprofit can decide when it's going to spend its money. Now, of course, there are always exceptions when we have, for example, endowment money or money that has been donated for very express purposes, which we call appropriated. So sometimes there'll be a donor or philanthropy that very specifically says, I want this money to be spent on X. That is much different. But generally, when we're talking about core operating monies or any monies that are generated by the nonprofit, there can be discretionary use of those monies. And again, there are always exceptions. So for example, with a grant, there'll be clear deliverables in the contribution agreement, what those grant monies have to be spent on. So again, yes, a charity can have a surplus. They do not need to spend all of their money as soon as possible. And they certainly can decide what to spend their money on. That a nonprofit, myths around a nonprofit cannot make a profit from its operations. Even investment income is a profit, so perfectly allowable. And the other one I hear from time to time, that a nonprofit can't spend money on administration, or they must spend as little as possible. The truth and the reality is, and you folks know this, that a nonprofit can and usually does and absolutely needs to spend its money on administration costs. So again, there's no way that we can reconcile the requirements of government, of our nonprofit status, our registered charity status. There's no way that we can meet the needs of reporting to our funders if we are not spending money on administration. So again, really want to sort of dispel that myth. And, you know, it's one that when we talk about, well, where does the charity's money go, or where does the nonprofit's money go? Yes, you know, generally the administration costs are those that are, you know, incurred to allow us to operate. However, nonprofits will only attract and retain sort of top nonprofit talent or expertise if they actually budget to remain competitive in the marketplace. And that's something I'm going to talk more about when we get into our session next week around attraction and retention of top talent, both employees and boards of directors or volunteers. So again, you know, the landscape has shifted. The demand for nonprofit personnel, and as I say, you know, earlier on in the session, you know, $170 billion of gross domestic product generated in the nonprofits in Canada. We absolutely need skilled and expertise talent, and that talent should be paid. So again, nonprofits really do need to look at attracting and retaining top talent, nonprofit expertise, and doing so in a way that really allows them to remain competitive in the marketplace. Historically, nonprofits have not done a good job of this. And if that investment isn't made, it is only to the demise of the nonprofit. So again, more on that if you're interested in that whole piece, more on that to come for next week's session. Before we leave just this idea of, so what I'm really trying to set the stage for here, folks, and dispelling these myths is that it isn't just about annual money in, money out. Nonprofits do need to run like a business, and that means we need to be thinking ahead. We need to be thinking about the what ifs. We need to be thinking about risk management. We need to be thinking about the cost of technology. We need to be thinking about the costs of the spaces that we're leasing, and are they adequate enough, or owning, are they adequate enough if our programs are growing? We have an awful lot to think about. And because of it not just being money in, money out in a single year, and truly being a stable and sustainable nonprofit, we need to position ourselves to have a sustaining reserve, to have monies set aside that will help weather through those maybe more challenging times. Many of us experienced that during COVID. We need to have money set aside with a plan to refresh our technology, to buy new sports equipment when required, to buy craft and art supplies, whatever it is that we require to run our programs. So again, when we talk about best practices, I would be totally remiss if I led you to believe it's just about money coming in every year and money going out and being accountable for that. It's much more than that. We do need to look at the liquidity of an organization. So simply stated, we want to look at the surpluses that an organization has of non-restricted or unrestricted assets, and that we can use those assets to do a number of different things. Think about the future, help weather us through rough economic times. What if we don't get core operating funding? What if we don't have a program continue that has management and administration money that helps support our operations? How are we going to get through those tougher times? And I will also say to you, most funders will know that an organization is stable, that a nonprofit is well run, healthy and well from a financial standpoint, if it does have a surplus. Again, having proper surplus management policy, having proper investment management policy. And again, happy to answer any questions that folks may have on that. How do I get started? What does it mean when we talk about high and low thresholds? I normally recommend 2.5 to 3 months of operating cost is what a nonprofit should have set aside in its sustaining reserve. Again, all of this supported by board approved policy and regular reporting on our investments that we're making, regular reporting on what that sustaining reserve looks like. If we're using anything out of a sustaining reserve, what is the policy to access that money, for example? So again, there are a number of best practices that really support the organization having a rainy day fund, and not for a moment thinking that that would be viewed upon negatively because you are a nonprofit. It is viewed favorably because it demonstrates that you know how to run and keep a financially healthy nonprofit organization, and that you're not just sort of living paycheck to paycheck, as I call it, or living year to year. You're actually planning for the future. So with those broader sort of global considerations around financial management, really what it comes down to, folks, is putting good systems in place. So we do need to have the policies, the processes that are going to support good financial policy for the board to approve an annual budget, policies that allow us to spend that money within the parameters that the board has approved. Equally so, it positions us as those running the organizations to really know what is going on, provide good reporting, and be able to share that with the board of directors. So really to be defensible in where our money's been spent, that we've stayed within the approved budget. It also allows us to evaluate in year to make sure that if there are any changes in what we thought. Remember, an annual budget really is just looking at what we think. It's our best estimate of what's going to happen in the year. Maybe our fundraiser generates more revenue than we thought. Maybe we don't get a grant that we thought we would get. So during the year, we can evaluate, analyze, and we can change that course of action if we have to. And that is where we'll actually do a reforecast on our budget. So we can do a couple of things. We have our annual budget, we have our actual costs coming in, and we can and should report to the board of directors any variances. If we're not on track, we want to flag that, and we also want to explain why through variance reporting. But we also want to look at our budget and say, well, if we had, for example, we planned on doing a fundraiser and because of COVID, we couldn't, that revenue from the fundraiser isn't going to happen. So let's reforecast our budget to still be trying to stay at a break-even budget if possible. If not, then maybe we're tapping into that sustaining reserve, again, all following policy to get there. So it allows for really informed management and planning, both for staff in the organization and for the board of directors oversight. And again, when I talk about that planning component, as we look at this continuum, the budget effectively based on what the organization wants to do based on its strategic plan. So again, what are those activities, programs, services, projects, initiatives that we're going to build the budget for that really allow us to support our vision, that longer term thinking? What is our mission? What is our mandate? And again, that continuum evolves as organizations evolve. I'm not for a moment suggesting you need to have all of the financial policies in place overnight, or when I share with you the financial management checklist and the policy checklist, I don't want anyone having a panic attack because you don't have these things in place. It does evolve over the course of time. It doesn't have to happen overnight. It is definitely an evolutionary process. And even for organizations that have really solid financial policy and procedures and internal controls, even they are continually revisiting their policies, usually once every 2 years, tweaking them as required, always looking for improvement within the policies and the processes that an organization has. But more or less, this is going to see the continuum that would happen. So in getting started, folks, what we want to look at, of course, is building the budget, building an annual budget. And the idea of budgeting beyond the numbers. So really thinking about our strategic plan, what are those, sort of core programs, initiatives, new initiatives, objectives that we want to undertake. What did we do last year? And it's funny because the last couple of years for any of the budget development that I've done for the nonprofits I work with, we've had a hard time because last year wasn't typical and the year before that wasn't typical. So we're actually finding in building current going into this fiscal year, whether it's 2022 or some of my clients, it's 22-23 fiscal year, we're actually finding ourselves going back about 3 years looking at our previous budgets as we're looking to return to pre-COVID processes or pre-COVID programs. So that being said, the previous year can always be a good place to start when we look at both revenues and expenses. So what I wanted to share with you here, again, just for demonstration purposes, I've put together a little bit of a snapshot. This is for an organization that is generating revenue through membership fees. They have a little sustaining reserve that's generating about $1,200 a year in interest. So they have about $140,000. They're generating some small interest every year. They hold a national conference that generates some revenue, and they also engage in sponsorship development, most targeted towards that conference that they hold every year. So this is just for example purposes only. You can see where a draft budget had been developed for 2021. I've run the actuals from the previous year as well as the budget from the previous year alongside. So I wanted to share with you how the organization looked at, well, here's what we planned for in membership fees in 2020. We were hoping to generate 43,000. We actually, middle column, generated 44,000. So we think that it is fair and reasonable in 2021 to budget that we will earn $44,000 in membership. We're hoping to keep it the same. If we have a look, just a little bit of a snapshot here, have a look at the expenses as part of budget development. You'll see that in 2020, there was a budget of $37,000 for head office and accounting. And then you're going to see that the actuals came in at $37,000 for that year. However, in 2021, the budget was set at $40,000 for head office and accounting. And as you can see, there was a note put into the column. This is because the ED has a contract increase that was coming into effect in 2021. So we're using the previous year experience, but we're also looking at any upcoming commitments for the current or the next fiscal year. Just by way of side note, folks, I often get asked in the development of a budget, when should it be done? The best practice is that the budget should be developed and through your audit and finance committee and to the board of directors and approved prior to the start of your next fiscal year. So if your fiscal year is, April 1st to March 31st, you would want to have your budget developed through your finance committee, approved by the board of directors prior to March 31st. So you are ready on April 1st of the next fiscal year. If your calendar year is January 1st to December 31st, the best practice would be to have the board approve the budget prior to December 31st each year. So again, you're ready to start the next fiscal year. A couple of other little snapshots here, just to give you a bit of example when the budget for this organization was being built for 2021. You can see that board expenses were budgeted for $9,000 in 2020. The actual was only $5,000 because of COVID. So there was less travel due to COVID. However, when the 2021 budget was being developed at the end of the last or previous fiscal year, the organization was anticipating that things would get back to pre-COVID circumstances in 2021. So they actually allocated that full $9,000 budget. As we know, things didn't get back, and this was an underspent line item for this particular organization. But when they were building their budget in 2020, in anticipation of that new fiscal year starting on January 1st, 2021, they were anticipating they would have that expenditure, so they included it. Again, you can see here, this organization starting in June of 2021 was planning to have some online support staff hired. So again, $800 a month that they budgeted for, starting from June of 2021 is what they were anticipating for hiring staff or hiring some online support staff. So again, how to build a budget, look at the previous year budget, look at your previous year actuals, and then have a little bit of that visionary look forward, what do we think is going to happen this year? Are we going to hold a conference? Are we going to have travel? Are we running a volunteer appreciation program? Are we going to be upgrading our website, for example? So what do we think those anticipated costs would be? And again, doing so prior to the commencement of the next fiscal year. So once we're in that year then, and this idea of understanding in-year financials, I just wanted to share with you, again, a little bit of a snapshot. So for this same example from the previous slide, I've taken the approved budget for 2020, and I wanted to give you an example of a reforecast, so an in-year reforecast. So this organization had an approved budget prior to the start of its fiscal year in 2020, and they ended up doing a reforecast in July of 2020, and this was because of COVID. And as you can see, this is a snapshot that's showing the actuals to November of 2020. So this organization is actually sitting for this financial statement, sitting at the end of November of 2020. So they have all their actuals in. And as you can see, they did a reforecast in July. So they entered 2020 with their budget saying, well, we're going to generate $44,000 in sponsorship, just like we have in previous years. COVID happened, and you can see where the reforecast was made. Oh, we're still going to garner some sponsorship, but it's only going to be $4,500. And you can then see that when they reported their actuals in November of 2020, they were successful in hitting that $4,500 in sponsorship. But it was so significant due to COVID that they did an in-year reforecast. So if you just pop down to the bottom and have a look at, oh, sorry about that, folks. If you just pop down to the bottom, have a look at the expenses, you can very quickly see where those offsets were made. So again, under membership programming, there were conference expenses of $15,000. Those were zeroed out. We're not going to be having the conference, or at least we're going to be doing it virtually, not in person. We're not going to garner as much sponsorship revenue. We're going to reduce those conference expenses. We're going to reduce travel expenses aren't going to happen due to COVID. We can reforecast those, so on and so forth. So again, the idea that, remember, when we're building our budget, it's just our best estimate at any given point in time. We always want to be reporting on our actuals and explaining why there's variances. And there certainly can be circumstances where we would actually reforecast that budget because something significant has happened in the year. That could be on the revenue side, or that could be on the expense side. So again, we want to be looking at the full sort of picture of what's happening beyond the budget that's approved. That's great that the budget's approved, but we're not going to continue with our spend plan if we've had a significant impact, as you see in this example, during COVID, to the revenues of the organization. So that just gives you a little bit of an understanding of in-year financials and maybe the idea of doing a reforecast. The next slide I want to share with you, something I'm sure many of you are familiar with, referred to as a profit and loss statement, or a P&L statement. It is also known as a revenue and expense statement. So some interchangeable language, it's synonymous. So you can use P&L, which is absolutely synonymous with income statement, or revenue and expense statement, sometimes even referred to as statement of financial activities. So regardless of the name, the profit and loss statement is a financial statement that summarizes the revenues, costs, and expenses that have been incurred during a specific period, usually a fiscal quarter or the year. And rarely there'll be other periods of time that would be looked at, but typically it is the fiscal quarter or year. These records in your profit and loss statement provide information about an organization's ability or inability to generate profit by increasing revenue or reducing expenses, or doing both, depending on what's happening in the year. So again, as I say, some refer to the profit and loss statement as a statement of profit and loss, or an income statement, statement of operations, statement of financial results or income, earnings statement, some individuals will use, or an expense statement. So again, lots of interchangeable language. What it does is really refers, the profit and loss statement really refers to how an organization handles its profit and loss statement through revenue and cost management. So are we at risk of a loss? Is there an opportunity for a gain? This statement considers where does the organization's money come from and where is the organization's money going? How does the board ensure proper actions with respect to revenue and expenses if they don't understand where the income is coming from and where the expenses are going out? And most importantly, that it is mapping over to that approved budget. So again, at a very high level, very typically, as I say, a fiscal year is the period that we would look at. And it gives us that, 60,000 foot overview and look at our income as well as our expenses. And are we looking at a potential profit or surplus, or are we looking at a loss for the year? If we are looking at a deficit, what amount of cash reserves would be required to protect the organization? So if revenue streams aren't sufficient enough, would we be using that reserve to help sustain the organization through rough economic times, for example? So again, here for this organization, I pulled, it's the same organization that I've been using as a sample for the last few slides. I just pulled their prior year, which was January to October. So I pulled almost to the end of their fiscal year of 2019 to show where they were sitting based on the revenues that were realized, the expenses that were incurred, and where they were sitting at the end of October. So in a really good, healthy financial surplus position at the end of the year, remembering there's still 2 months left, November and December. And the reason I wanted to show the profit and loss only up to the end of October is to demonstrate that we can do in-year cash flow reporting, that we should do in-year cash flow reporting. So again, I wanted to share another example. This is a different organization that I just want to show more than one type of revenue stream. So for this organization, they're getting a municipal operating grant. They have different project grants, a small amount of membership, social enterprise, or that, remember we talked earlier about, the myth that nonprofits can't have commercial enterprise. Yes, they can, as long as those profits are going to support the mandate of that registered charity or that nonprofit organization. So again, a little bit of social enterprise. And for this organization, the highlighted column at the very top, the months through January through October are in fact actuals. So anything in those columns are going to be actuals, and anything in the November, December are going to be the approved budget and what we think is going to be spent in those months. So again, if we can track our in-year cash flow, what month specifically are we expecting the monies to come in, we can start to figure out if there is going to be any concern with our overall net cash flow. So if you look at this overall net cash flow, this organization that's starting its fiscal year at the beginning of January does not have any significant revenues coming in until the beginning of the second quarter. So they know going in, starting their fiscal year, they are going to have expenses in the month of January, February, and March, and they're not going to have enough revenue to sustain those expenses in January and February. So in each of January and February, there's a negative cash flow. So that means that the organization either has to have some sustaining reserve that it can use to float and cover the costs of those first 2 months, or it may have to have an operating line of credit. Again, that's a myth I often hear. Nonprofits can't have credit lines. You absolutely can, to help sustain those months while you're waiting for significant revenues to come in. So in this example I'm sharing with you, the significant revenue is coming in the form of an annual operating grant, but it's not coming until the month of April. So again, expecting some small project money in March. So we should be okay in March. By April, we're receiving the bulk of our annual revenues. And from there, we know that we're going to be okay managing our cash flow for the rest of the year. So again, this is another reason to have some type of sustaining reserve to manage not just when the money's coming in, but when the expenses have to go out. So with our in-year cash flow, and again, it doesn't have to be generated in extensive accounting software. There's many in-year cash flow statements that I do within Simply Accounting, Excel spreadsheets that I'll use for smaller organizations to manage their month-to-month actuals and compare that to the budget. So with all of this being said, folks, we're at the place where we are looking at best practices that come in the form very often of policies. And I have listed only a few here. When I send you, or Lynn sends you, the financial management checklist after the session today, as well as the financial policy checklist, you're going to see that these are some of the best practices and policies that I've outlined. This is not intended to be an all-inclusive list. I just wanted to flag that you will be looking at the one tool, if you will, to consider your overall self-assessment. It's a self-assessment tool for your organization's sort of financial health and wellness. So a bit of a checkup, if you will. And then looking at financial policies and a checklist of financial policies. So again, some of the best practices and policies that you're going to see, various different accounting controls. If you are an organization that handles cash, receives cash, it could be at events, it could be petty cash handling within your organization. If you have a credit card in your organization. So again, we recognize organizations can and do need credit lines to help sustain their operations. If you have credit card, do you have policy? How do you reimburse expenses? Do you have segregation of duties amongst who is approving an invoice versus who's paying the invoice? Do you have delegation of authority? That would mean spending limits. So certain individuals in the organization have a threshold that they can spend up to, and over that, it would require board approval, for example, or perhaps the treasurer actually signing that particular instrument, signing that check. Other documentation, information security, auditor review requirements, so policy around auditor review, policy around how we're investing our surplus, and restricted funds management. So we have restricted funds, appropriated funds that can only be used for certain activities. Do you have policy around that? So again, you're going to see a number of best practices and policies set out in the checklist that will be shared with you. So I always sort of say at this juncture, we've covered an awful lot when we talk about the basics, if you will. So finance for non-financial managers, just getting the basics in place to make sure that we're paying attention, not just in building our budgets in a way that makes sense, but also monitoring them through the year. So now that we've looked at sort of those core components and set out a few of those basic policies that you would see, I just want to cover a few more of the common financial statements that nonprofits will generate, that they'll share with their board of directors. Again, up to this point, the main message is having a really thorough and well thought out budget process, having a really appropriate approach using previous years, thinking about what you want to do this year in building out your budget, having effective tools, having effective policies. But now I want to look at, we're not quite done yet. I want to look at some of the more basics when it comes to financial statements themselves. So the first is recognizing, folks, that with financial statements, we're really just looking at a snapshot. And I'm going to share with you, well, what does a snapshot look like? Whether that's a month or a quarter or a year. From there, and that time determination, that snapshot in time, we're going to generate financial statements. There are major or main components to financial statements. And I want to share with you some really good nonprofit examples just for you to have a look at, moving a little bit closer to this idea of reading and interpreting financial statements. So I want you to know, first and foremost, it's about a snapshot in time. We'll look at a number of different typical financial statements. I've listed a few there at the bottom that would make up a complete set of financial statements, and very specifically look at some nonprofit examples. So again, when we're talking about a snapshot in time, we always consider who is going to be reading your financial statements. So often organizations will include financial statements in annual reporting that reflect a whole year. So this is that snapshot. Let's assume a fiscal year of January 1st to December 31st. This is the snapshot of the year. And very often we will include that in our annual report. As we're considering financial reporting, we consider the audience, but we will also look at the three main financial statements. And remember that the financial statements, in essence, are really telling a story about your organization during a specific period of time or during your snapshot. But also remember that the statement of the financial position of the organization, because it's a snapshot, also allows us to consider activities, changes that may happen. So if we're looking at a snapshot that's just a month or just a quarter, it also allows us to think about what's coming next. So again, we start with our snapshot one period of time. In this case, I've said, well, it's a fiscal year snapshot that informs our financial statements. So the first financial statement I want to look at is the statement of financial position, which is also and more often referred to as the balance sheet. So when you're looking at the statement of financial position, or you're looking at your balance sheet, it really represents the assets of the organization, the liabilities of the organization, and the equity of the organization. So the idea that what are our assets, what are our liabilities, and overall, what is our net, if you will? What is our equity of the organization? This statement is important because it really helps your reader. So thinking about who your reader is, the board of directors or members, or if it's in your annual report, it might even be going out to funders, for example. The statement is important because it helps the reader, whomever the reader is of the financial statements, to assess the financial health of an entity. This is what we're talking about, the overall financial health of an entity. So if we look at an example of, or the components of a balance sheet, it is particularly helpful to determine the state of the liquidity or the entity's liquidity relative to its risk exposure. So by that, what I mean is the balance sheet must always balance. The name of the balance sheet, even though it comes by other names, such as the statement of financial position, is in fact based on the fact that the assets will equal the liabilities and the net assets every single time. So the balance sheet shows your organization's assets, what you own and what you owe, as well as your overall net assets. So again, this is a snapshot in time. In this case, this is a full year, and I've given side-by-side year of the statement of financial position of the balance sheet to show what has changed from one year to the next. So when we look at the reserves, or operating, or sometimes referred to as surplus, the idea is that we have money sitting in our cash, money sitting in our investments. We have an overall positive cash position at the end of the year. So compared to last year, where we were sitting at 160,930, we're sitting at 164,405. So it's referred to as a positive cash position. Again, you can see that the cash on hand and the investments overall increased slightly and are documented in something called a note. So a financial note at the end of the financial statements, sometimes at the bottom of financial statements, to help the reader better understand what goes into those numbers. And again, I'll give you an example of notes. Again, just to articulate, well, what goes into a note? How does that help me understand the overall health of the organization? So that's the first one, your balance sheet. The next one I want to look at is the statement of financial activities, also sometimes referred to as the statement of operations. So when we're looking at our statement of activities or our statement of operations, what we're looking at here, and again, some folks will refer to this as an income statement, and many nonprofits will generate different versions or varieties of a statement of operations or an income statement. So for example, some funders may want to see a separate income statement just for that program or just for that service or that project. This would represent the overall organization's income, expenses. Do we have a surplus or are we in a deficit situation? So again, the components of the statement of operations, fairly straightforward, and certainly, as I say, can be even more specific if you're wanting to generate an income statement just for a program or just for a conference that you're holding, for example. In this case, I've just given a snapshot again at a year end with a side-by-side comparison that's simply showing where the revenues came in, the change in revenues, and obviously the changes in expenses that were realized, and that the organization had, a much more improved performance in 2020 compared to 2019, where they were sitting with a surplus at the end of 2019, still a good positive cash position, but a much larger surplus at the end of 2020. So again, this is where, certainly the treasurer, executive management within the organization, but certainly the treasurer and the board of directors, not only are they going to be monitoring throughout the year, because there should be no surprises when a board or a treasurer is looking at a statement of operation. There should be no surprises if they're monitoring being provided an in-year cash flow statement. But again, now we're going to ask the question at the end of the year, well, why did we have that significant surplus? What changed so dramatically in revenues, or where did we have a major reduction in expenses? So as you can see here, there were two areas in particular. One is that personnel was reduced. They weren't able to fill a vacancy within the year, and that they also significantly reduced their physical facility. They were able to move into a different facility that had a much lower lease rate. So again, we ask and answer the question around those variances of the components of the statement of operations. So when we're looking at, and we looked at cash flow earlier, the idea of looking at month to month, for example, for cash flow, I also wanted to share with you, just looking at the statement of cash flow that would appear within financial statements. So it's great to have that statement of cash flow throughout the year, so we can show what's coming in each month, where the expenses are going out. But in the statement of cash flow at the end of the year, it's sometimes referred to as statement of changes in net assets. And what that really means is that we're just looking at, instead of month to month, the money coming in, when we anticipate it coming in, when the money's going out, we're now just looking at the entire year. So what was the cash we started with, what moved in and out, and where did we end at the end of the year? So again, in our cash flow statement or statement of changes in net asset, for example, we asked, did the organization generate positive cash from its operations? If not, was that just a one-time issue, or is it a trend that's starting to develop? And many organizations went through this during COVID as they saw reductions in revenues or other changes that were happening because of reduction in revenue, maybe reduction in expenses as well. The other thing to remember with the statement of cash flow or the statement of change in net assets, we can look at it and say, for example, can we examine, was the purchase and redemption of investments, for example, consistent with our organization's investment policies and strategies? Did it make sense? Is there something we could be doing differently? Were there any expenditures, cash flows from financing? Did we borrow money? Was there interest you incurred on an operating line of credit, for example? So again, all of these ins and outs in reference to the last slide, where did we start with our cash in? What were all of the ins and outs through the year? What is our cash position at the end of the year? So for this snapshot that I've shared with you here, as you can see, The cash at the beginning of the year was lower in 2019 than 2018. However, the cash by the end of the year was recouped somewhat. So again, sitting in a positive cash position with just slightly more cash available at the end of the year. So again, looking at all of those ins and outs. Again, folks, as I say, critical to all of this work around examining the core components within financial statements is looking at the notes to the financials. So again, with the notes to the financials, I wanted to give you a small example from the slide earlier where we had cash and a little note number 3 beside. So that note number 3 from the financial statements, I've just pulled and shared with you here. So again, remember, we think about who the reader is when we're looking at creating financial statements and making sure there's enough information to help them understand what is being included in this document. So for this statement of financial position, the cash is $159,389. And specifically, we want to tell the reader more about that. So we've included note number 3, which speaks to our cash on hand at the bottom of the screen and our operating reserve sustaining policy. So we are telling the reader, as at December 31st, 2019, in our Bank of Montreal checking account, we had $12,266. And in our Manulife savings bank account, we had $147,123. So our overall cash at the end of the year is the $159,389 that we see in the statements. So again, this is very helpful to the reader. Think about a board of director member who's been looking at, just the operating budget, the revenues and expenses, the in-year cash flow. And at the end of the year, we have $12,000. But why do our statements show that we have almost $160,000? So again, it's that opportunity to share more information about what is included in the financial statements. And just a note as well, folks, very often nonprofits don't realize that when you are receiving, particularly at year end, and you're receiving your audited financial statements, so these basic ones that we've looked at, balance sheet, the cash flow, the statement of financial position, there is opportunity for you to actually adjust the notes in the financial statements. So many organizations think that, when the auditor provides those draft audited financial statements, including the financial notes, that they can't be changed. And they absolutely can be changed. So again, no one knows your reader, your audience more than you do. So if there is something very specific you want to include in the notes to really make those statements clear for your readers, whether it's a funder, your membership, you're putting it in your annual report, just know that you can certainly work with the auditor to make those changes. It's not carved in stone that what the auditor puts into those draft financial statement notes has to be exactly what's there. You absolutely have opportunity to provide input and make changes. So again, remember, we really just want those statements to have as much information so the reader can understand what they're looking at. So with that, folks, I know we've covered an awful lot in our session here this morning. I wanted to make sure that I preserved a bit of time for any questions and a question and answer session that may be required, or any comments or specifics that folks may want to ask about. Again, in wrap up, as I say, financial statements can present a really effective, and it's a very effective way, and done right, it can be a very efficient way as well, of painting a picture of the organization's operations. And again, by taking the time to really understand the information within the financial statements, board members, even staff within the organization are much better able to both assess the organization, its wellness, its current organization status, its current organization financial position, but also to be a little bit more informed about the policies, the things that are really required to make sure that the board is confident in that accountability, that transparency of the organization. So again, with really well done financial statements, it doesn't have to be onerous, and it certainly does support better decision making in organizations as well. So again, as I say, I've got a couple of takeaways that I've shared with Lynn, and I'll certainly be happy to answer any questions following this session. I just wanted to include a quick reminder of next week's session, where we're going to look at effective recruitment and retention, both for staff and for volunteers. That includes your board of directors. And certainly looking forward to getting into that content with folks next week. In the meantime, again, just a huge thanks to the Community Engagement Research Unit, a huge thanks to Lynn, huge thanks to South Sask Community Foundation for their support, so we are able to deliver these sessions. I'm just going to move away from my shared screen, folks. I'm just going to stop sharing, come back to you in the main room. And I'm more than happy, folks, to answer questions. If there are any in the chat, Lynn or Victor, just let me know. I'll maybe pop over here to the chat now too, that I'm out of the shared screen. And if anyone has any questions you'd like to put in the chat, or if you want to turn your audio and video on, you're more than welcome to do so. I am happy to hang out with you guys for the next 10 minutes or so here, if there are any areas of discussion or any questions that folks have.
Hi, Sherry. Thank you very much. This is a great lots of information. Anyway.
Yes, it is a lot.
Lots and lots and lots. For sure. I really appreciate that. I am a board treasurer for a group, well, a group home, I'll say. We're funded by the government. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything specific that I've been around for a while on the board, and can't say that I have really strong accounting knowledge. And so I guess a lot of times I'm wondering, what sort of questions should I be asking in that situation? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, for sure. And depending on the type of reporting that you're getting, Janice, like, first of all, do you guys meet once a month or once a quarter?
Once a month.
Once a month. Okay.
Or more often if you need to. Yeah.
Okay. So for the financial reporting that you're receiving, what I would be looking for, first of all, is that you're getting the reporting. So every month you should be getting that financial reporting. If you are not receiving a report that shows you the board approved budget next to the actuals, request that report, because the best way to ask informed questions is where you can say, right, as a board, here's what we approved. And if those expenditures, in the first month or two of the fiscal, probably not a lot is happening. But as you're moving into the fiscal year, if there are significant variances, or there's no expenditures that are happening, or too much is happening in any particular line item, that's where I would start with asking questions. So again, it's not, and remember, as a board member, I feel the most comfortable and confident when my board members are asking me questions, because I don't want them to be uninformed. So, it could be a simple thing. Oh, I noticed there's no money spent. We approved $3,500 for insurance this year. Nothing's been spent. Oh, well, that's because, staff will explain, well, that's because our insurance premium or our insurance policy doesn't renew till October. You'll see it in October, which is also why I like that in your cash flow. If you're not getting it, that's also a really great statement, because it shows you where the money's coming in and what actually has gone out. And again, if you can look at that compared to what the board approved as the budget, if there's anything that the variance is way high or way low, like, looking for variances is your number one, Janice, for sure. Yeah. The only other thing I want to flag for you, and only because you mentioned you sit on a board for a group home, the other thing that I always flag for any nonprofits that are working with individuals in vulnerable sector, supported independent living program, your funder does a basic standards review every 2 years. very often, and particularly for group homes, because there's an entire set of policy that your organization should have adopted that comes from government. It's called the CPP and SP policy. I can talk to you about it offline if you want. But for your organization, you want to make sure that that CPP and SP policy is actually embedded into the organization's policies. And as a board member, you need to know that that basic standards review has been complete and any findings from the funder, because that is a unique risk in the supported independent living vulnerable sector. But again, I can stay online with you after the call if you want, or we can talk offline.
Yeah,
Because
I would appreciate that. Wow.
yeah, because as a board member, yes, risk management, and remember I said earlier today, it's mostly financial. It is, but there's other risk you need to be aware of. And every organization that is unique. So if it's a nonprofit that deals with, you know, like I just did the Regina Farmers Market strategic plan, they have different risk around food risk, food safety risk, right? Every organization has it. You have some unique risk in yours, and I'm happy to talk about that. But through the financial lens, that perspective, the best, especially, you know, in building financial literacy, or even if you just, when you're going to board meetings, have your board approved budget in front of you. Because again, that's going to show you when you're looking at these other reports, if it's not side by side, are we on track? Is there any area I want to ask questions about? Again, depending on if there are investment vehicles, when are you getting reports on interest that's been earned? Have you had to draw, has the organization had to draw out of their reserves? There's a number of areas that sort of flag, but to get started with, it's really just looking for those variances and asking questions about that. Yeah, that'd be a good starting point.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, at the beginning of this, it said it was being recorded. Is it possible for, say, a new board member to look at your presentation at another time?
Absolutely. Janice, when I send the documents that Sherry was talking about, I will include a recording. You can share that link with anyone. Eventually, somebody from the university is going to post it to my website, but that's kind of, you know, I don't know when that'll happen, but you'll get the recording today. So you can please share it widely. The more people that know this information, the better.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, I just have found so much really good information. Thank you so much.
Oh, excellent. Good. Happy to help, Janice. And again, happy to connect offline too.
Sure. I think we will. Yeah. If you could, do you want me to email you or?
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. Any other questions or things that folks would like to ask about? Not missing any in the chat, am I? Sorry, I didn't have a look here. I think we're good. Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, and again, folks, as I say, particularly with this session, because there's so much information that's covered, I often find that folks will go away and they almost need a bit of time to digest or go back through the slides. And then you'll end up, or you're doing your statements, you know, looking at financial statements at the end of the month, or maybe you're just getting your audited statements now from your auditors. I often find that questions will percolate after sort of absorbing the content. So again, everyone is more than welcome to send me an email if anything should come up as you're considering this information and maybe going back and looking at your own financial statements and have more questions. So certainly invite you to do that. Reach out at any time.
Well, seeing that it doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in right now, Sherry, I just want to thank you for being such a great presenter and being so generous with your time, and that that spirit of generosity and giving back to the community is often rare. And I think I can speak on behalf of everyone on this Zoom line today that we really appreciate that. As a very busy consultant, this is just very generous. Like folks, you'd laugh if you could have seen like just how hard it was for me to us to figure out times where we could get Sherry to
No worries.
do these sessions. So
my absolute pleasure. I did have a private message that was just sent, and it's a general question. What do I recommend for organizations with no staff? And that is a good question. Again, for organizations with no staff, just remember all of those responsibilities are still there. Having a 100% volunteer organization doesn't negate having to do all of the financial reporting and meeting requirements. I think I mentioned at the last session, Lynn, I had just done a workshop for Special Olympics. Their Saskatchewan leadership team got together for their annual leadership conference in Regina a few weeks ago. So I went over to the DoubleTree, and they're unique. Every one of those communities, it's 100% volunteers with only their provincial office having paid staff. And so again, my recommendations, 100%, stick to the basics, keep things very simple. So when you're working with your volunteer board who are still doing the work, having basic, it could be basic accounting software, it can be a basic spreadsheet, documentation, keeping receipts, trying to find a volunteering community that likes doing that type of work. So you have somebody who's interested on the board in tracking and sort of organizing the financial components. It doesn't have to be onerous, but it does need to be done. And the board of directors as a whole is financially responsible for the organization. So, use the most simplistic tools, basic spreadsheets. For the individual that asked the question, send me an email. I'm happy to send you some basic spreadsheets that I use for my smaller clients that just allow, you don't need to have a full-blown financial policy manual. If you're a small organization, you just need to have some really simple but robust systems in place to keep track of things. So again, if there's no staff, there's still a requirement to be transparent and accountable. Boards hold that responsibility. So again, it doesn't need to be scary or an onerous exercise. There's some simple tools to get you there. So you're more than welcome to email me, and I'll share some additional tools that might just do the trick and help when it comes to the financial management of a small organization with no paid staff. Happy to do it. Sorry, Lynn, I just saw that one pop into the chat.
no, that's great.
Good. Fantastic. Well, I sure look forward to seeing folks. Hopefully everyone can join next week for our effective recruitment and retention. Again, it's another area that I think, historically nonprofits, there's lots of myths out there. There's a lot of things that we can do much better that don't take a whole lot of work and really can bring in some pretty fantastic personnel and volunteers. So look forward to that session next week.
Okay, well, thanks again. And I hope everybody enjoys this beautiful day. I don't have a window in my office, but I understand it's about plus 23 outside. So I take that as a good sign, good gardening season.
That's right, exactly.